Okay, this afternoon's story is again from Tatterhood and Other Tales. It is called The Hedley Coup. There once was an old woman who earned her living by going on errands and doing odd work for the farmers' wives in the village where she lived. Although she earned only her midday meal and a bit of cheese and bread to bring home for supper, she was always as cheerful as if she hadn't a want in the world. Each day she rose early to gather branches and pine cones. These she laid ready near the hearth, and when she returned home to her cottage in the evening, she made a fire to keep herself warm. Her cottage was small and poorly furnished. It stood by itself on the outskirts of the village, but she declared she was quite content to live alone, and she didn't mind the long walk home at all. None the less, the farmers' wives of Hedley made sure to send her on her way before sunset. After dark, the Hedley coup was abroad, and the Hedley coup had terrified the villagers since times long past. Whether he was a bogey or a hobgoblin, the village folk could not decide, but they did know he could assume fearful shapes and scare people out of their wits. He would chase them home, hooting and bellowing with raucous laughter, and other times he enraged them with all manner of mischief and pranks. One summer evening, as it was getting on toward dark, and the old woman hastened homeward, she came upon a big black pot lying at the side of the road. "Now that," she said, stopping to look at it, "would be just the thing for me if I had anything to put into it. Who can have left it here?" She looked all around to see who it might belong to, but she could see no one, either in the fields or on the road. "Maybe it'll have a hole in it," said she. "Aye, that'll be how they've left it lying. But it'll do fine to put something in. I'm thinking I'll just take it home anyways." And she bent her stiff old back and lifted the lid to look inside. "Mercy me," she cried, and jumped back, "if it isn't brimful of gold pieces." For a while, she could do nothing but walk around her treasure, admiring the yellow gold and wondering at her good luck, and saying to herself, "Well, I do be feeling rich and grand." But presently she began to think how she could best take it home with her. She couldn't see any other way than by fastening one end of her shawl to it, and so dragging it after her along the road. "I'll have all the night to think what I'll do with it," she said to herself. "I could buy a grand house and all, and live like a queen. Or maybe I'll just bury it in a hole at the foot of the garden. Or I could put a bit on the chimney near the teapot as an ornament. Ah, I feel so grand I don't know myself rightly." By this time she was rather tired from dragging such a heavy weight, so she stopped to rest for a minute and turned to make sure her treasure was safe. But when she looked at it, it wasn't a pot of gold at all, but a great lump of shining silver. She stared at it and rubbed her eyes, and stared at it again, but it was still a great lump of silver. "I'd have sworn it was a pot of gold," she said at last, "but I reckon I must have been dreaming. Aye, now, that's a change for the better. It'll be far less trouble to look after, and not so easy stolen. Gold pieces are a sight of bother to keep safe. I'm well quit of them, and with my bonny lump of silver I'm as rich as can be." She set off homeward again, cheerfully planning all the grand things she was going to do with the money. It wasn't long, however, before she got tired again and stopped once more to rest. Again she turned to look at her treasure, and as soon as she set eyes on it, she cried out in astonishment, "Oh my! Now it's a lump of iron! Well, that beats all. It's real convenient. I can sell it easy as easy, and get a lot of pennies for it. Aye, it's much handier than a lot of gold and silver that would keep me awake at nights thinking I'd be robbed. A lump of iron is a good thing to have in the house. You never can tell what you might need it for." So on she went again, chuckling to herself on her good luck, until presently she glanced over her shoulder just to make sure it was still there. "Eh, what's this?" she cried as soon as she saw it. "It's gone and turned into a great stone. Now how could it know that I was just wanting something to hold my door open with? Aye, that is a good change. It's a fine thing to have good luck." And all in a hurry to see how the stone would look in its corner by her door, she trotted off down the hill and stopped at the bottom beside her own gate. Then she turned around to unfasten her shawl from the stone, which this time seemed to lie quiet and unchanged on the path. She could see the stone quite plainly as she bent her stiff back to untie the shawl end. All of a sudden, it seemed to give a great jump and a squeal, and grew in a moment as big as a horse. It threw down 4 lanky legs, shook out 2 long ears, and flourished a tail. Then it kicked its feet into the air, laughing raucously. The old woman stared at it as it capered and shrieked and rolled its red, shiny eyes. "Well," she said at last, "I do be the luckiest body. Fancy me, seeing the Hedley coup all to myself and making so free with it, too." The Hedley coup stopped short in its rearing and bellowing to glare at her. "You're not frightened?" "Not me," she laughed. "'Tis a rare sight you are." "Most folks shout and curse at me," said he. "Aye, and run screaming." "There's no harm done," she answered cheerfully. "I still have my bit of cheese and bread for my supper." She gathered her shawl about her and opened her little gate. But when she looked around, instead of the great gangling horse, there stood a small man in a pointed cap, scuffling his feet on the path. He was brown as a russet apple, apart from his scraggly white beard. "Well now," said the old woman kindly, "I don't have much, but you're welcome to come in for a bit of supper." "Don't mind if I do," said the Hedley coup. So he sat down to supper with the old woman, and somehow the bit of cheese became a large chunk, and then there suddenly appeared on the table some nicely boiled brown eggs and crumpets for their tea. They made a cheerful meal of it, and after they finished, they sat beside the fire, while the Hedley coup regaled the old woman with stories of his pranks. She laughed until the tears rolled down her cheeks, and she declared that never had an evening passed so quickly. As time went on, the little brown man came by often for a bit of supper and an evening of talk, and when the old woman found her woodpile always stacked high and her cupboard always stocked with food, she very wisely said nothing about it to anyone. The village folk still talked fearfully of the Hedley coup, or cursed him for his mischief, but the old woman would chuckle and say, "He be not that bad. Happen he like to kick up his heels a bit, he do." The end.